Welcome to another episode of Well, Don't Tell the Kids. I'm Janet Lee, your host, and today I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Carolyn Bain Pugh. Thanks so much for joining me today, Carolyn.
Thanks, Janet. Always a pleasure. I enjoy your conversations very much.
Carolyn joins us today from a suburb of our nation's capital, where she and her husband, Bill, have raised their family. Now, I see that you are originally, Carolyn, from the great city of New Orleans in Louisiana.
That is correct.
Yeah, and then you went to high school in Grand Prairie, Texas.
Yes.
Also in the South. How did that transition come about, going from Louisiana to Texas?
Oh, well, talk about change. I grew up with change, to say the least. Born in Austin, Texas, but my parents divorced when I was about a year old. So I went with my mother back to Louisiana, and so spent the school years in New Orleans, and then in the summers, as I got older, I was off to Dallas to see my dad and stepmother. And so I was a commuter kid long before it was trending. Then in high school, Mother decided to move to Texas, so Grand Prairie is a suburb of Dallas.
Okay.
And then I went on to SMU for a Bachelor of Fine Arts and a Master of Fine Arts in Theater.
Theater and theater directing.
Yeah.
You followed your natural inclinations to get into theater.
It really was a seed that was planted by my mother, who was, while she was teaching in the public school systems, was also finishing a master's at Tulane. So we had access to going to all the plays at Tulane University, and had a huge impact on me. And it just happened that Tulane was a premier voice for theater in the country at that time. That was completely coincidental. I only later realized that, but no wonder it had a huge impact on me. So besides wanting to make up stories, this reinforced the power of storytelling. And the academic world was so familiar to me. I mean, I basically grew up sitting in the quadrangle area of Tulane while Mother was in class. So that was a natural fit for me.
What was she studying at Tulane?
She was finishing her master's in English. The story was, you know, as a single mom, you with two kids, you make a lot of, talk about changes, adaptations. So she had her master's in art, and there were no vacancies in the area schools where we could all be in schools together. So brave woman that she was, took on finishing her master's in English to keep the position that she had in the high school there, and took on student teachers because she was finished in art and education. So she was training the student teachers, getting her tuition paid, and going to class at night while teaching high school English all day. But managed to take us to the theater and the opera and the symphony all the time. So I had an amazing cultural education.
Does any particular performance stick out in your mind from that time period?
Oh, yeah. I got to see Van Cliburn when he came back from Russia.
Oh my goodness. It's historic.
And, yeah, it was. Unbelievable. Also, I remember being at Othello and telling her I was walking out.
Say that again? Pardon me?
I remember being Othello and Rigoletto, both. And I said, really, this is too much for me.
Okay.
But other than that, Ibsen and Strindberg and everything else, that was perfectly fine.
Too much for you as in it was not a good
violent
performance or production, or it was just the subject?
Violent, yeah.
Wow. You know, art has the power to move people.
It does, and I guess you find your limits. Yeah, but I was really studying piano all the time. So even through high school and even in college, piano was my, passion and devotion and competitive arena. Yes, I did a lot of theater, but not really knowing that was what I was going to do, because it was a situation where my father, being a real Dallasite, said, so if I am the one who's going to be paying for your college, you're going to SMU. I said, not even knowing a thing. And yet again, so I started out in business. Yeah, he thought I should be a stockbroker. So I started out in business, and the summer even before the school year, the college first year started, and I was slugging it out in that first year of, all the courses that in the American system they make you take. And Business 101, and I finally went to my dad and said, you know what, I don't think I'm going to finish if I have to stay in this.
That must have been quite the gathering up your chutzpah and your the conversation.
Particularly to my dad, he was quite the Texan. He said, well, I just expect you to get out and make a living. Okay. So that was his challenge. I could pretty much then go do what I wanted to, as long as I could let him know that when I got out, I'd be able to get a job. So I went about searching the campus and going to things. And again, I found my heart in the theater. I found what was going on there. It gave me a truer sense of what my internal conversation was about. And I knew that I could live with that. And I knew I'd have to be really good at it in order to get a job. So that became a clear focus. And it was really clear. It was just clear. That's where I had to be, was in the Meadows School of the Arts, and I was not happy anywhere else. So it didn't matter how much work it was or what I had to do. And so I ended up finishing my BFA in 3 years and went straight into graduate school, which all summers, all breaks, all everything for over 2 years. I was one of the really lucky ones to get a job straight out of finishing my MFA.
That moment of clarity, after a lot of struggle and such a gift in any person's life.
Yes, it is.
The more I do these conversations, that is definitely a gift. It does not always happen. And then I see you earned your doctorate in theater and performance studies at the University of Maryland in College Park.
I stayed at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, long enough, 8 years. I received tenure. I was associate professor. And
at the theater department.
Head of theater, and another Y in the road, the calling of media. That had always been sort of a natural calling as well. I don't know why I have the ability to think in technical terms, but that seemed to flow as well. So I made that change and went back to Dallas for part of my sabbatical, and also took part of my sabbatical at Arena Stage, working for Liviu Chule, a truly world-class director, who was asking
Arena
me if there
Stage
was
here in Washington. Okay.
And what I found was that the director was asking me if there were jobs at the university, and I realized, wow, the professional theater world, hearing my father's voice, almost impossible way to make a living. So I followed the media track and spent a year in Dallas working for a production company, took a leave of absence from the university, then became very, very involved with that kind of work and did not go back. So Bill joined me in Dallas, and we were there, I was there 4 years. And then he decided he really wanted to be in Washington, so he made the big leap up here.
As many people do.
So he made the leap up here, and it took me about 1.5 years to move my business, so I was on my own by that time. Then, after many years of running Bain, Pugh & Associates, which is a corporate media firm working primarily for DoD contractors, have a huge experience in the military, which I treasure, supporting the military. And then I realized that theater voice was not still, so I decided to get my PhD, which I started in 2001 and finished in 2007, but I was still working and raising Anna at the same time. So you can do it. And it was Betty McWhirter. I said, I'm thinking about getting my PhD, but I don't know. She says, well, you're going to get older with or without it, so just go do it.
Betty McWhorter being the former pastor at
yes.
St. Patrick's Episcopal Church in D.C. Yeah, that sounds like classic Betty there. Well, that's interesting that the voice would not, the voice keeps beckoning through.
Absolutely. I think the voice is tied to telling truthful stories.
To telling truthful stories.
Yeah.
Is there a story that pops to mind, if you don't mind sharing, you felt had to be told, or from different sources?
It's making the internal voice heard. So it's from the psychological point of view. Like the writer Tennessee Williams, he's the one that drove my dissertation, but I think it's those writers who tap into the awareness and the psychological truthfulness, and then find ways of putting it on stage in a viable and dynamic and artful way. That's the voice.
Did you do a lot of on-stage performance? From what I'm seeing, it seems that you're coming at it from a different view, where you're analyzing it, interpreting it, teaching it, passing it on to the next generation. It's just...
Well, that's why I have found directing was really my calling. I liked to know the whole background and context, the social context, political context of the story, so that framing the story and then telling it. So take all of the performance work in the classes, but really it was to inform my dealing with other performers and actors, and then really understanding the ensemble that is created and needed to put on that whole story rather than just being a single participant. I was way too interested in the overarching experience and its impact on an audience.
I can see the parallel or the connection with your media messaging, the content development, and the strategic overview, or instead of down there on ground level.
Exactly. I mean, all of that work in directing and analysis is completely in line with marketing and getting to the super objective is what we call it in the theater. And
super objective?
Super objective, yes.
Okay, super objective. New word for the day.
So, I mean, that's completely consistent. So we all sort of approach things from different sources, but the goal, I think, is the same.
Now, you've touched upon Tennessee Williams, and that's who you...
That's my
your
muse.
Thesis was,
he's my muse, yes.
Now, why? Why is he your muse?
He's a poet and has a beautiful way of articulating the internal story externally. Certainly the American, the Miller, and O'Neill are fabulous in doing that, but they are not the poet. Whereas Tennessee Williams, he writes arias, basically, for his actors in his storytelling capacity. And he's compassionate. He's compassionate. He's not just objective. He's really quite compassionate in how he constructs relationships and deconstructs them. His language is the difference, absolutely. And his sense of compassion for the situations in which people find themselves. And he sees people as survivors, that they do things that seem unconscionable, but they're trying to survive within the context of the world that surrounds them.
Any recommendation which one I should pick up again?
Oh, Streetcar. Streetcar Named Desire.
Streetcar Named Desire. Oh. Or with whom do you identify most in that?
I identify with...
That's a loaded question.
No, I mean, of course it takes place in New Orleans. That's, and that's my mythical city, as it was his. It was his. He wasn't born there, but he always referred to it as his spiritual home. So I think it's the context in which he places these characters. It's not one character. Again, I'm a director.
So the ensemble, the togetherness, the collectiveness that creates something.
Situation, exactly.
You did on the outward or the exterior. It seems like you've taken, many turns, but your internal compass was quite fixed on a North Star, or aligned.
Or that would be the South Star.
Any reflections on that? Running your own business, Bain, Pugh & Associates. This is what you were referring to, media messaging?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That was a large chunk of time there.
That's my major career, of just having to, you have to sell everything you produce and direct. But that also was very much about storytelling and getting to the point of what needed to be communicated. I just think being self-employed it was not intentional. It was not intentional. It's just one of those things you do the best you can. And your associates then become your clients and your suppliers rather than your colleagues within an organization. And you got to really work hard to sustain those things.
Did you say that this was in the DoD, Department of Defense arena earlier?
I worked a lot in the IT area supporting these companies' work with the military.
Seems like you apply your process to different arenas.
Absolutely. It's transferable skills, and I was grateful for that. It's the same analytical skills that I studied as a director, absolutely transferable to developing marketing programs and plans and executing them.
That's a great strength, to recognize developing that and then also just executing it and implementing it and using it.
Yeah, so that's why just realizing that educational foundation, whatever you're studying, and I think the arts are particularly powerful in the sense that there's a reality associated with them. It costs money to start with. The curtain goes up on time and drops, and you have a responsibility to your audience. The criteria is so clear in the performing arts, where it's quite that clear in a lot of the other academic areas.
It's almost like a publication. Well, you work in publication as well, but publication where there's a firm deadline, and
Yes, but how many are publishing books when they're undergraduates? They're trying to learn to write, and when you're in the performing arts, you're doing it all.
Although nowadays the self-publication is becoming more prevalent.
We hope. We shouldn't have to wait for publishers. I think it's a powerful thing is to get your work out there in whatever medium, whether it's performance or writing, but really
or a podcast.
Yeah, exactly, and also just sticking with something so that the questions themselves are rich. I think that what happens in marketing, having spent a lot of time there, is that we don't have the time or take the time to really get to the question that's going to make the difference, the discerning questions. They're very top-heavy rather than vertical, and that's the beauty of the PhD later in life, to reinforce that. Although I do recommend get on with it earlier.
The 7-year route. Well, 7 years, it's not that far afield in the time frame. I did some reading recently about storytelling, trying to inform my activity here, and I read something interesting, that very good story, you're not just telling the facts, but then you get to the story. There's a TED Talk going on, and then there's something, the ones that are most memorable is that the speaker will say something that violates what the listeners are, they're moving along, they're listening, and then there's something that cuts the other way. Do you find that to be a particularly effective tool in your marketing or in theater?
Again, informed by the theater work and also by the, theater is condensed. And of course, in media, it's only gotten shorter. So you have to create the same dynamic, only in shorter periods of time. For instance, on stage, you have to establish, again, the given circumstances. And then a domino drops that changes the course of those that changes the course of the story. And that has to happen. That has to happen for it to be interesting. But you have to establish the context. Otherwise, it's all hysteria and spectacle. It's spectacle. And we've been enamored with spectacle recently. Forgotten to really set the context in which this is happening. So we have to keep digging. But so even if you've got a string of dominoes, some don't fall right away, some fall in a different direction, but it's that intricacy, like boring music, that creates the story and the shape and the dynamic of the story. But also, something has to change in the shape of a story.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're bored to death. If there aren't changes, like the protagonist, if that protagonist doesn't change, then it's just facts. And I've told many, many clients, I said, when they're throwing things at me, I'm talking myself out of business, but I'll say this really goes into print. It does not go into video, because video is about motion and emotion. Motion pictures, it's just so obvious. And when you forget that, you're throwing money away, and it's not cheap.
I'm just thinking about the parallel that with what you just described to life in general. That, like with the Truman Show, that great movie. Questions: what is reality? What is fiction? Poses your point of view, your frame of reference.
Well, and what performance studies does is look at performance in everyday life. PhD work. You really do look at how the ordinary is being framed. Everything we do is shaped by our environment and the interaction and the context. And if you start to deconstruct your own world, you'll see all of the theatrical elements that are at play in the construction of
how the ordinary is framed. That's such a great phrase to think about.
Well, it's a hard place to be, though, when you realize it's all just theater.
Well, I guess the most touching moments are when theater becomes really alive, are those moments where there's that connection from the stage to the audience, to the individual.
Well, and as performer, all people, it's when you lose that self-consciousness and are so richly immersed in the moment or experience flow, or peak experience, and then you're able to forget all of those conscious awarenesses, but you know that you are doing the right thing for which you were prepared.
The magical moment, I suppose, or the magic time.
And I'll just say that the other thing that's sort of really, it's trying to always feed yourself what powers you, and that's what I hope I can share with Anna, for instance, is to realize you have to have your own mechanisms for feeding your energy, or you have to pick the right people, because it ebbs and flows, and just to know how to reach out and recharge and revitalize along the lines that are your core.
So.
Well, it was ironic this morning on my Richard Rohr. He said in a quote, I just had pulled it here, at our low points, we are one step away from either enlightenment or despair. Okay to find those, to go there, but because you're right at another crossroads, and you can choose enlightenment or despair.
I think that we shall leave off at this great philosophical point. Leave this for the listeners as food for thought, So that's about all the time we have for now, and I wanted to thank you, Carolyn, for your insights and your conversation.
Thank you, Janet. It was a lot of fun.
And thank you all for listening. My guest has been Dr. Carolyn Bain Pugh, and I am Janet Lee. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Well, Don't Tell the Kids.